Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for coming to this session, Terms of Engagement. I'm Jillian Schultz, I'm the editor of Griffith Review, and it's my pleasure to be facilitating this session today. We've got a terrific panel, and they're talking about both their lives, their work, and books that have been written. Megan Davis, who will start the conversation this afternoon, has an essay in the Participation Society edition of Griffith Review, arguing for a formal process of female representation in formal Indigenous politics, which is really sort of picking up on a concern which has been around for a long time, but really bringing to the arguments about the place of women in Indigenous politics a formal and legal and sort of quite interesting, the fresh sort of feminist approach to these questions. Megan is the director of the Indigenous Law Centre at the University of New South Wales, and her scholarship involves critical analysis of Indigenous public law issues and Indigenous people's rights in international law. She's also an Australian member of the International Law Association's Indigenous Rights Committee. She's worked closely with the UN for many years as an Indigenous lawyer, and I've mentioned her essay. The next speaker is Wesley Enoch. Wesley, I would think, is, if not known to you personally, I'm sure many of you have seen his wonderful, the wonderful plays that he's directed and produced over the last, well, we're saying 10 years, a little bit longer.
Oh, not that old.
No, he's a young man.
Easily.
The first time I met Wesley was in Brisbane in the mid-90s, around the time that he and Deborah Mailman put on 7 Stages of Grieving, which was the most an extraordinary moment to see it in a little tiny black theatre in Brisbane, in the White Theatre. And it went on then to have a life of its own, and both Wesley and Deborah have also gone on to forge terrific careers on the stage and theatre. Wesley's noted for his focus on Indigenous issues, has a strong commitment to new work and new writing and strong community storytelling. He's been very much involved in doing a sort of research undertaking about investigating the possibility of establishing a national Indigenous theatre company, which has thrown up a lot of interesting insights into the way Indigenous politics play out in the arts. He was a major contributor or source for the Currency paper, House paper essay that was released at the beginning of this year, Your Genre is Black, Indigenous Performing Arts, which Hilary Glow and Katja Johansson wrote. And I think that Your Genre is Black was actually a quote from
Richard Franklin, actually,
that's right,
about his about filmmaking.
Yeah. Then we will have Jillian Corrishaw. Jillian is an anthropologist whose field is the relationship between Indigenous and other Australians. She's worked in Arnhem Land and in Burke in New South Wales, and over the last 10 years or so has been doing a very intensive project working with Indigenous people in Western Sydney. Her new book, sorry, I've worked through my pile of books here. The City's Outback is actually absolutely terrific. I mean, it's both a scholarly work and a work of a very accessible work of contemporary anthropology and history and human stories. It deals with Indigenous people in Western Sydney. And finally, at the end of the table, down at the dark end there, is Sarah Medicine. Sarah is the author. Well, I won't tell about her old books. I'll tell her about her new books. Her most recent book is Black Politics, which is book number here, which was released earlier this year. Sarah teaches as an Associate Dean at the University of New South Wales, where she's taught Australian politics and public policy for some time. And her new book explores the complexity of Aboriginal political culture, and it is indeed very complex. So to get this started, I'd like to ask Megan to begin the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Jillian, for inviting me, and it's a pleasure to be here today on this very distinguished panel. I'll just, in terms of my research, I'll directly refer to the essay that I wrote in the Griffith Review. My essay was about Aboriginal women's representation in Indigenous politics. In particular, the federal government's current commitment to establish a new Indigenous national representative body, I think provides us with a unique opportunity to reshape the way that we do business, politics with both the Australian state and also with each other in the community. And we know that establishing a representative body for Indigenous Australia is aimed at ameliorating the utilitarian tendencies that are inherent in ballot box democracies, where politics are dictated according to the greatest happiness of the greatest good, and where citizen participation is really quite minimal. So the task of designing this new representative structure is a rare opportunity, I think, to reshape politics. And I was also selected out of a number of people, I think 100 people were selected to attend the representative body in Adelaide in, I can't remember, it was in March. And the report of that initial meeting of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people from across the country is available on the Heriock site. And I think it was a really interesting exercise in terms of raising all the issues that people have about representation across the country, because with such small, discrete groups or communities across the country, it's going to be a very difficult task, I think, a very complex task. So my essay reflected on how this was an opportunity to reassess the way we've done business in the past when it has come to Aboriginal women, and the way in which decisions are made about their lives. Aboriginal women, Indigenous women, comprise just over half the Indigenous population, and within our communities, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women are the primary nurturers and caregivers, and we hold important cultural, organisational and leadership roles. Yet for decades, they have borne the brunt of violence in communities, and their voices, and certainly this is, on the basis of evidence, certainly with respect to ATSIC, their voices have not necessarily, they haven't been represented as well as they should have been in those public institutions that purport to represent Aboriginal women's and Torres Strait Islander women's voices. My concern with this, and this is broadly the topic of my doctoral thesis, is that the evidence-based crisis of endemic violence that is committed against Aboriginal women in urban and regional and remote communities really undercuts the claim that Aboriginal women are valued members of Aboriginal society. And we must, I think, as a community, move beyond the kind of stock standard narrative responses and rhetoric of egalitarianism and separate but equal idealism of traditional communities, and focus more on communities today that routinely commit and permit violence against women and children, and figure out ways of moving forward and how we can implement, I think, processes within this new institution that will reflect a respect for all the many groups that constitute Indigenous communities. And I think that one way of doing that is to ensure that the unique experiences and needs of women are addressed in an institutional way by equal representation in any new body. And I think the opportunity to design a new body is a time also to push the envelope on this idea of democratic representation. And certainly it wasn't, at the Adelaide meeting anyway, it wasn't just about women's representation. I think you need an institution that really reflects the groups that make up our community, and that includes youth. There was a large youth representation. Our population is predominantly, under the age of 30 and urban-based, and you need an institution that reflects those groups, those needs. I guess just in finishing, the one important development since the essay was written is that the national rep body, I didn't really have to push the 50-50 argument. I think some prominent leaders turned up and came up to me on the first day and said, it's great to see our resident feminist here, and we're hoping you'll be pushing the feminist line. But I don't necessarily think that that's, equal representation is really crucial, not just to Aboriginal women, but it is also to Aboriginal men and good governance. So I actually found that I didn't really even have to push the 50-50 argument. Obviously, there's always some people that don't agree philosophically with that, but generally, most Aboriginal men and Aboriginal women, the people participating in the conference, agreed on that point.
Were you surprised at that?
Yes and no, yeah. I think a big part of it was that it was equal representation of women and men at the actual meeting. Mm-hmm. So I suspect if there wasn't a gender, if we hadn't have argued for a gender representation of the people who were selected, it might have been different. Mm-hmm. But that's why you need women in the room. So whether that remains on the case in the final model is yet to be seen, because who knows what happens behind closed doors. So the final point I'd just like to make is that international human rights law has been really fundamental to the advancement of Indigenous rights in Australia, particularly in terms of legislation and the common law. But it's important to keep in mind that we can't pick and choose what aspects of that international framework that will be applicable to our communities and our cultures. And I think Tim Rouse put it really well, actually, in the Coercive Reconciliation book, where he argued that if human rights law is really fundamental to your advocacy, which it has been in terms of all our great gains in terms of particularly land rights and native title, if that law is so fundamental to your advocacy, then communities really have to be porous to all aspects of international human rights law. And I think that this means opening up the conversation more to women's rights and women's issues should be more prominent and widely debated and discussed as much as non-discrimination and race is. So that's...
Thank you. Wesley?
Firstly, I'd just like to acknowledge the local people here, the Gadigal people on Eora land, and say that I come from Brisbane, Noonuccal, Noogie people on Stradbroke Island. And I get my name Wesley James Enoch from Wesley, the Methodist ministers, James, the apostle, and Enoch, Genesis 16, which was given to my family by missionaries 5 generations ago. And we've promptly forgotten what we were called before then. And my great-grandmother, I love this story, my great-grandmother's name was Piety. And she was noted for giving both my grandmother and my great-uncle over to the church so she could go and be a missionary across Queensland. Now, and I say that because I think that there have been this generational shift in a lot of policy that's happening in this country. So for my grandparents and my great-grandparents, there was this thing of just basic survival. Food, just living, trying to keep it all together, try to keep your family together. And in my parents' generation, there's been more policy which is about more political rights, if you like, the whole idea of voting and access to education and equal opportunity and self-determination. And I see that my generation more and more is going to be our struggle will be about cultural continuity, about cultural redefinition, and about using our stories and our language and our songs to actually strengthen who we are. Just to give you a bit of a picture, just to pick up some of the points that Megan's saying, just under 70% of all Indigenous Australians live in urban centres. About 50% of the Aboriginal population are under 35. At the moment, we have an inverted population pyramid that just over half of the population, Aboriginal population, have been through high school, which is amazing given my father only went to year 6. And that the average wage for an Aboriginal Australian is around $33,000 a year, which is, kind of interesting to see. I mean, I'm sure there's great extremes and that's why it all kind of comes out. But the picture I'm painting is 30 years of different policies, or even 40 years if we go from the referendum, the whole idea that some things are working. My great-aunt, the last of that particular generation, died yesterday, and she was 77, and she was considered to have a really good innings. And when you mark her age, 77, to when my grandmother died, which was 65, 10 years ago, and you start to think, well, things are shifting. Just on an anecdotal level, things are shifting. What will be the major issues in 30 years' time? I think we're caught in a paradigm of disadvantage, that a lot of our definitions of Aboriginality at the moment are based on being access to education, access to health, housing, employment, and that the kind of what I call the white guilt issues, where we can guilt non-Indigenous Australians into supporting us to get what we need to survive, will start to run out in another 30 years. This is being very optimistic, I can assure you. In 30 years' time, we might have the kind of equality of lifespan, employment, education. Well, this is a hope that it'll happen. So what will be the issues then? What will be the things that define Indigenous Australians as unique to this country? And I think the argument for my generation now will be about that cultural issues. So for me, the paradigm shift has to start now. A lot of the stories I was telling 10 years ago, even 15 years ago, were all about trying to address disadvantage. A show like Stolen, about stolen generations. There wouldn't be an Australia now that doesn't have, either through a play like that or through a film like Rabbit Proof Fence, or even through all the news cycles that have kind of churned through this story, there isn't an Australia now that hasn't had some kind of connection to that particular topic. Great. So when you do a story about stolen generations, people say, I know that, what's the next step? The big thing, I reckon, for me is about how do we demonstrate cultural capital in a world now. And a lot of the policy decision-making is based on this disadvantage, but also is what I'd like to say non-cultural. It is centralised decision-making based on very good democratic principles, but it doesn't take into account the cultural reality, which is anarchic social structures. You know, anarchic in the true sense of anarchy, self-determined family groups and clans. So how do we look at a policy framework that reflects the very nature and the cultural nature of our communities? This is heresy because it goes in the face of democracy. It goes in the face of, you know, the greater will out. My job is to look at what are the stories of the future? How do we engage in cultural maintenance in terms of language, dance, song, traditional values and cultural values? But how do we also leave behind things that are no longer relevant? Some of the kind of stuff that's happening in the Northern Territory, and this is contentious, the whole intervention into the Northern Territory, a lot of the defence has been about these are our cultural, traditional values. It's traditional for me to beat this woman, my wife, in fact, my third wife. It's traditional for me to have access to my nieces for sexual pleasure. Now, these kind of things we have to interrogate on a truly cultural value system and say, what do we want to leave behind? What do we think is the truth for the future? And if we're kind of being the most optimistic we can, as I like to think, in 30 years' time, there may be issues of... I looked at Nunavut, which is a Canadian model. People might be able to speak more highly of this one, or more detail about this one, where in Canada they've set up basically an Indigenous state, which looks also at a state-based library, a state-based museum, a state-based education curriculum, and it has the power of politics at its base. In this country, I'm advocating for a virtual Indigenous state with representation in the Senate, which you'd get out, the full 12 senators. You get 12 senators, Indigenous senators there, and centralise some of this kind of power and decision-making. I am strengthened by the feminist movement in the 70s, which looked very much at... one thing that stuck in my head was, for women to have power, men have to step back from it and give power or at least allow women to take that space. I think in 30 years' time, we'll see these arguments more and more. How does Indigenous Australia, through our moral authority, through our continual kind of occupancy of this land, how do we justify and strengthen our position culturally, politically, and also, I think, broader than just our own community, look at indigenising everyone? Thank you.
Thank you, Wesley. Now, Jillian, just by way of sort of introduction to what you're going to start to talk about, I think it's interesting that both Wesley and Megan come out of that sort of urban first generation to be educated in a serious way, making that transition, and so your work sort of is looking at a different group of people in that sort of urban Western Sydney. But here we have two wonderful, stunning examples of what can happen. Absolutely, yes. And there's sort of freshness and originality and great leadership capacity.
Indeed, the people I worked with in Mount Druitt are a long way from getting up on any stage of this kind, I'm afraid. My work is very much about the terms of engagement, as you said, Jillian. And as the session is about. But in everyday life, I've been always looking at community life as an anthropologist working in a community and getting to know people in their everyday sense of who they are and what life's about. relying on fieldwork. Anthropologists rely on fieldwork, ethnography, which in fact means immersion in the community and getting to know people through everyday interaction. And always but I've always been interested in that frontier between Aboriginal people and non-Aboriginal people. And sometimes this is between communities, but very much within communities, as Wesley mentioned, I think, and even within families and even within individuals where people have loyalty to a non-Aboriginal ancestor, say, and an Aboriginal part of their family as well. So there is a divided, people are divided. I mean, all people are divided, but it's particularly painful in many Aboriginal communities, I think. Working in Mount Druitt had some problems. As an anthropologist, I'm expected to work in exotic places. It's not true that anthropologists work in exotic places all the time. Anthropologists work in boardrooms and barrooms and clubs and do studies of all kinds of things. But if you're an Australian anthropologist working with Aborigines, you're supposed to be in the Northern Territory. Now, I did work in the Northern Territory, so I got my credentials, and one of my books is about blackfellas. What's it called?
I can tell you.
No, that's the Burke one. Rednecks, eggheads and blackfellas. That's the one about the Northern Territory. I included everybody. And with sympathy, I must say. I've worked in New South Wales, though, for the very reason that Wesley outlined. Most Aborigines do not live in remote places, but in suburban and rural communities. But when I say I'm working in Mount Druitt, most people think I'm studying on some kind of mission to do good, to expose the injustices, or to give an account of pathetic lives without culture in the western deserts of Sydney. But they are not my aims, and I want to read you how the book begins. I'm in Glebe, upstairs in my study. There's a vigorous crashing on the metal knocker on the front door of the house in Glebe, and I'm in a state of alarm as I run downstairs, open the door, and there's a dark, dishevelled figure with wild hair, lean and edgy, and a gravelling, menacing voice says, "I've come to make a land claim on this property." The grim expression dissolves when I say, "Frank Doolan," and he shakes my hand flamboyantly, ready to cut and run, ready for a fight or fun. Now, Frank was in town that day to deliver something to the court where a young Aboriginal boy was being sentenced for a murder. And he explained to me with care and precision that this boy didn't deserve the long prison sentence. He placed the boy's plight within his family story of violence and pain. These are Aboriginal experiences. It is an Indigenous condition that made this lad vulnerable to becoming a victim of his own anger, violence and confusion. Punishment on top of punishment, a wasted life that could be reclaimed. Frank struggles with his tears. Okay, that's the opening of my book. Frank was insistent that I go to Mount Druitt. I was still writing a book about Burke, which is where he comes from, where I'd met him. He said, there's true black warriors out there. He said, he always had this sort of slightly ironic notion of how to make important the people that he took very seriously, which were mainly the alienated youth of Mount Druitt. But he also had a terrible sense of the feeling that people were dying. And once, when his aunt died, he said to me, "See, she's dead," and nobody recorded her story. So, just one little story about Frank before I move on. I met him he was in Bathurst at Charles Sturt University when I was there, and once he took it that I'd slighted one of the other Aboriginal students in a tutorial, because one's supposed to have critical discussion in tutorials, and Frank wasn't really up to that at that time, and he had a one-man demonstration outside my window saying, "You think you're the great white hope, but you're just another white woman who doesn't understand." Now, that's a good basis for a friendship. And, in fact, Frank and I are very good friends now. He can make a land claim on my property anytime. So I went to do fieldwork in the western suburbs, which I think of as the city's disavowed subordinate self, the poorest branch of the urban family. Those suburbs are where we don't want to be. Frank took me to meet Aboriginal people who were both ordinary and extraordinary, and I recorded life stories from many, many people. For instance, a young girl who'd had a baby at 12, she'd been fostered and her mother had been fostered and her baby was taken from her. Now that sounds like a tragic tale, but in a way in Mount Druitt it's an ordinary story. That's an extreme one, but I'm saying that people whose lives would appear to most of my urban friends as horrific and incredibly painful, these are ordinary stories among many of the Aboriginal people out there. So the city's outback is about research itself, also about a white woman doing research among Aboriginal people, and I have quite a discussion about that, defending to the hilt anthropology but particularly ethnography, which is getting close to people, living side by side with people, not studying people from the outside. What did I find there? I found all sorts of different sorts of people with different political theories, different views of rights, different views of the high flyers in Aboriginal politics, for instance. I found personal histories of stolen children, people with confused and unstable histories, people, for instance, who didn't know where their parents came from, rage and destructiveness. I found a sense of lack and longing for the old structures, for the old culture. And that notion of culture, I might come back to that if I have time, the notion that Aboriginal are cultured and have this thing that we white fellas particularly desire and love, that is traditional Aboriginal culture. And there seems to be an element of cruelty in expecting people to have such a quality when they've had such a destructive past. Most important, there were a lot of thoughtful people who were fully aware of their predicament, being on the one hand the favourite wounded subjects of national sentimentality, and at the same time being excluded and marginalised from mainstream society. So in my book I try to do justice to all those voices. I might finish with this one quote from one person I think is he's quite a contrast with most of the usual positions Aboriginal people take. I call him Barney, but he's not unrepresentative. But he would have an argument with you, Wesley, about the notion of cultural capital. And this is quoting the man I call Barney. Our people haven't got that education. They haven't got the basic daily living skills, and that's where we're going wrong. We don't know how to budget. We don't know what to cook. He said at one point, capitalism won't stop and wait for you. Hey, catch up, Jack. It'll just go on. So they keep saying we've got to get our culture back and that'll save us. It won't save us. We can have all the culture in the world, but because we haven't got the daily basic living skills, that's when we're going backwards. The ones that want to hold on to that anger have been hurt at some stage by the past policies. Instead of them saying, what am I doing to change, they're blaming Captain Cook. And then he said, and in the light of Samson and Delilah, that wonderful film that's just come out, he said, look, they've got culture up in Alice Springs. He said, and look, it's the stabbing capital of the world. What does culture do for you? Thank you.
Thank you. Before we go to Sarah, actually, Wesley, I'd quite like you to respond to that, because otherwise we might lose the thread of that bit of the conversation, and I think that could be quite...
Absolutely. I think it's totally contentious.
Yeah.
It's a whole kind of disease versus symptoms argument as well for me, that, at the heart of all of this stuff is, in fact, that the overturning of any kind of economic system and cultural system has created a lot of these symptoms as well. Now, how do you deal with it now? I think it is at least a two-prong approach, that you have to imagine a vocabulary for the future in terms of what is, in terms of culture. I've got friends going through initiation and stuff from Brisbane who will go to Cape York to go through adoption and kind of initiation that way. I think that it's there to be accessed, and it's interesting because there's this part of me that goes, I sit here as a university-educated kind of white mother, black father kind of stuff, and already in my head I'm going, but am I authentic enough? Do I have enough cultural capital? Am I defining myself by what I'm not rather than who I am? And there is a point where we have to engage in the world in a confident manner. Now, how do we get that confidence? is part of this two-prong thing for me. Yes, we have to make decisions. And so, yes, my grandfather beat my father beat me, but you have to make a decision to cut that off. You have to stop the chain at some stage. Now, that takes confidence and a real kind of sense of self, I imagine, to do that. So this thing is going, culture is part of that, I think. To know who you are and where you come from, or to have access to that cultural capital is really important. Even if it is something that you don't, have an unconnected line to. I mean, you couldn't claim a native title on this kind of information, but I think it's important for where we come from, as well as, and not to dismiss or leave behind the kind of economic and the other kind of development that has to happen, but it has to be two-pronged. It's not one or the other.